This man is about to commit ritual suicide. He has just seen 40,000 people burned to death, incinerated by a fiery tornado, and he thinks he is to blame. The year is 1923. The place is Tokyo, Japan. One of the world's largest cities will be destroyed by earthquake, firestorm, and anarchy. The catastrophe will shape the destiny of a nation and change the course of the 20th century. This is the Great Kanto Earthquake, one of history's perfect storms. Modern-day Tokyo, a megalopolis of more than 35 million people. It's a city that's risen from the ashes, not once, but twice in the 20th century. On the 10th of March, 1945, in the most devastating air raid in the history of warfare, U.S. bombers ignited a firestorm that destroyed the city. But what's often forgotten is that destruction on this scale had happened here before. In September 1923, following the Great Kanto earthquake. It means that today, little, if anything, of old Tokyo is left.
You just don't find anything old here, anything historical. It's all been sort of swept away. There's not a great drive to preserve. There's more of a desire to grow and build and grow upwards and grow outwards, tossing aside the old in favor of the new.
But if the old city of 1923 has been lost for good, it remains alive in the memories of those who survived the disaster. Tei Suzuki is 108 years old. On September 1st, 1923, she's just 18 and working as a pharmacist's assistant.
一番最初はね、横浜で、薬局、薬を作っておりました。
She's about to experience the deadliest earthquake to ever hit mainland Japan.
The first seismic shock began to be felt by seismometers in the University of Tokyo at 11:58 a.m. It wasn't immediately obvious to people that this was going to be a major earthquake. It's only after the initial shocks lasted for as long as they did and grew much stronger over time that it was even experienced seismologists understood that this was something that quite out of the ordinary, nothing they had experienced up to that point.
In 1923, a quarter of the population of Japan lives in the Kanto region around Tokyo Bay. Yokohama is Japan's main seaport, its window on the world. And Tokyo is the imperial capital. It was a city of stark contrasts, where relics of medieval Japan still had a place in the modern city. In the ancient red light district of Yoshiwara, girls were still being sold into a lifetime of slavery and prostitution, as they had been for centuries. Meanwhile, beyond the locked gates of their brothels, the lives of millions were being transformed by modern innovation and progress.
Tokyo in 1923, on the eve of the earthquake, is as vibrant a metropolitan center as you're likely to find anywhere on the planet at this point.
This was the period when you really began to see Japan's industrial might develop. I mean, in the early 20th century, you had the streets of Tokyo filled with rickshaws and ox carts. By the 1920s, you had a developed train system.
Motor cars are increasingly present on the motorways. Everything you would associate with a modern center in the 1920s anywhere else, whether it's London or New York, Tokyo is there. It has those things.
After centuries of self-imposed isolation, Japan has opened up to Western trade, and the seaport of Yokohama has become a privileged haven for wealthy American entrepreneurs. Men of money, like Otis Poole.
He kind of personified Western social elite of the city. He was also very much in the center of the disaster and wrote probably the best eyewitness account of what happened on that day.
Poole makes his money on the Bund, on Yokohama's seafront, and lives with his young family in the Western Enclave, high above the city on the bluffs. It's a privileged existence, which will come crashing down on the day of the disaster.
Basically, Yokohama, that era in Yokohama is destroyed. Everything was extinguished in the course of an afternoon. Really, one of the only traces of that era is what I've got in my hand, the Grand Hotel Guide to Yokohama, which was published in 1898. The Grand Hotel of Yokohama truly lived up to its name. It was an over-the-top, sprawling Victorian edifice that occupied the equivalent of several city blocks along the Bund, the seafront promenade. If you were a traveler, affluent tourist traveling in the Far East in those days, the turn of the 20th century, the Grand Hotel was the place you wanted to stay.
With modernization comes a new sense of Japan's place in the wider world, and with industrialization comes military might. By 1910, Japan has defeated both China and Russia in battle, and made Korea its colony. While Westerners led a privileged existence in Japan, the Koreans did not.
All the sort of derogatory terms you can imagine being applied to minority communities elsewhere were applied to Koreans.
And in the wake of the disaster, it's the Koreans who will find themselves the scapegoats. It's September 1st, 1923, just 2 minutes before noon. Across Tokyo and Yokohama, 8 million people are preparing for lunch, many of them on open fires. The prostitutes of Yoshiwara are still sleeping. Across the bay in Yokohama, at the Grand Hotel, it's happy hour. Even today, these are cities that live in the shadow of imminent disaster.
The people who live in Tokyo region normally feel some shaking every 2 or 3 weeks. So very frequent.
So frequent, in fact, that 1% of all earthquakes recorded around the globe happen right here. The Kanto Plain stands at the intersection of tectonic plates, the size of continents. They push against each other until the pent-up energy snaps.
Normally we have a very strong friction between these two plates, and the plate just stuck, but if still pushing. If the strain is large enough, Eurasian plates all of a sudden just rebound.
The result, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, producing long tremors.
Most of the seismometers go off the scale.
Estimates range between 30 seconds and a full minute, a series of shakes.
Personal accounts of guess it sort of culminates in a large rolling motion, which people describe as being on the ocean in a boat and sort of going as the waves come over, very large waves.
Tremendous shaking, enough shaking to basically bring down 90% of the buildings in Yokohama in that period. Just collapsed. Total obliteration.
It's September 1st, 1923. The place is Tokyo, Japan, just before noon, when the lives of 8 million people are thrown into turmoil. The epicenter of the Great Kanto earthquake lies just 15 miles offshore beneath Sagami Bay. Among the first to be hit by the shockwave are passengers on a train traveling along the coastline. In the village of Nebukawa, southwest of Tokyo, the train stops on a bridge above a gorge, waiting for a signal change. On board are 113 passengers. The time, not quite 2 minutes before 12.
The train began to shake. Luggage fell down from the overhead compartments onto the floor. Trembling, chaos inside the compartments. People didn't know what was going on. Then suddenly the cry of Jishin, earthquake, earthquake.
The tremors last for several seconds. The train teeters on the brink, but the bridge holds. After a long moment, the danger seems to have passed. But then...
there was a roar in the background. People turned, and over behind the railway bridge, you can see these green hills. In the distance, mud shaken loose by the earthquake, tumbled off these mountains. An avalanche of mud, huge cascade of mud and earth, tumbling down this ravine, smashed into the train, knocked it off the bridge, sent it 100 feet or so into the ravine, and then the mud continued to push it down into Sagami Bay.
all but one of the rail cars are sucked into the silt, and more than 100 passengers trapped within disappear with them. The mountain is stripped bare by a torrent of debris that now buries everything in the valley below.
The mudslide, after knocking the train into the water, then buried every house in this ravine. A few dozen houses, 300 people died, covered in mud. Basically, you had about 400, 450 people killed in the span of about 15 seconds in what probably was the most dramatic moment of the earthquake.
From the epicenter of the earthquake, waves of death and destruction radiate across the Kanto plain. And in the port city of Yokohama, it takes just 30 seconds for 90% of the buildings to collapse. American entrepreneur Otis Poole survives the quake, but is stuck in the ruins of Yokohama, not knowing the fate of his family on the bluffs. 18-year-old Tei Suzuki is also one of the lucky ones.
5年も10年もね、重なり合ってこの影になっていらっしゃいました。その汚い海の中に親子が抱き合って亡くなって浮いていました。外人の方がとてもこの公園になっていらっしゃった時は本当に胸いっぱいになりました。
How victims react in disasters has now become a field of scientific investigation.
I think we all carry around ideas in our heads about how we personally will respond to disasters. Sometimes people think they will become hysterical and start screaming, and that isn't what happens. Now, their response may not be very helpful, but it's not what they expect.
怖くないも感じない、もう本当にどうしていいかわからない。
The problem with it is that it can slow you down, and there isn't always a lot of time to be wasted in these situations. So this period of delay can be very dangerous.
While those like Otis Poole and Tei Suzuki have survived the earthquake, they are about to face a new and far greater danger. Although the Tokyo of 1923 has gone for good, clues to its utter devastation can still be found hidden in the modern city.
この場所はですね、関東大震災の前の東京の様子を、かなり思わせるような場所ということですね。つまり、木造の家屋が非常に密集していて、それで道が狭くて、で、道もまっすぐでない、そういう状況の街です。復興する時に東京の街は区画整理をしますけれども、その区画整理をされなかった場所です。ここは。
Pre-quake Tokyo was one giant tinderbox. Making the disaster worse, the timing of the quake.
The earthquake happens right around lunchtime, so that many people do have cooking fires going, and that probably contributes, at least to some extent, to the fires that break out.
Less than an hour after the earthquake, it becomes a race to outrun the perfect storm. Flames surround Yoshiwara, the city's red light district. Cut off from the outside world, the prostitutes panic, desperate to escape what will be certain death.
However, the madams and their bodyguards did not want to lose their valuable source of income, so they locked the women in their homes. They also locked the gates so that the women could not escape.
These women are now trapped, imprisoned behind an impenetrable wall of flames, which is coming closer and closer to them. September 1st, 1923. After the most devastating earthquake ever to hit Japan, Yokohama and Tokyo lie in ruins. But it's about to get even worse. Today, in an old cemetery in the heart of the red light district of Yoshiwara, there is a Buddhist shrine. It stands near the site of what would become a scene of unimaginable horror. Imprisoned by the brothel keepers, and cornered by the inferno, hundreds of women are now trapped.
Yoshiwara, like most of this densely packed poor neighborhood of Tokyo, was a neighborhood of tightly packed wooden houses, very vulnerable to fire. As the flames advanced, the madams finally relented, opened the doors to the bordellos, let them outside, and then led them to a small park in the center of which was a pond, where they figured they would be safe from the advancing flames.
Pursued by fire, with the sky ablaze in a terrifying orange glow, hundreds of women flee for this stretch of open water, their last hope.
One by one, these women jumped into the pond. Flames were basically flickering right there at the edges of the park. Panic ensued. The women started jumping in one after another. Those who were holding on to the edges of the pond were pushed into the center of the pond by the continual procession of women jumping in. More women entered, pushed them out. They drowned as well. And at the same time, ashes, glowing embers from the advancing fire landed on the pond. So within a few minutes, you had this churning, fiery, massive humanity panicking, climbing onto each other, and one by one sinking to the bottom of this pond. At the end of this afternoon, when the fires had died down and people came to inspect the damage, they counted 490 bodies, corpses of these young women, very few of whom were over the age of 19, in this pond.
Across Yokohama and Tokyo, there are now hundreds of separate fires. And by a cruel twist of fate, a typhoon now skirts the coast of Japan. It brings not rain to douse the fires, but 60-mile-an-hour winds that whip the flames of Tokyo and Yokohama into raging firestorms.
We believe that there are multiple examples of these firestorms that move through the city. There's almost no other way to explain the rapidity and the force with which the fires decimated the neighborhoods that they did.
早く火事から逃げろっていう声が、私もその中にね、多少何か着る獣とかお金を少し用意しようと思って中に入ろうと思っても入れなかった。それで周りは火事。
Near the Honjo district of Tokyo, a densely populated and tightly packed neighborhood of wooden buildings, there's a large depot area. As fires consume the neighborhood, the chief of police now makes the fateful decision to direct people towards what he thinks will be safety.
He basically steered thousands of people, ended up being about 45,000 people, to this patch of ground.
So it seemed a perfectly reasonable place to seek shelter. There's no buildings that might catch fire, nothing significant on the site.
In times of disaster, those in authority are forced to make snap decisions. And for the rest of us, their getting it right or wrong can mean the difference between life and death.
On 9/11, there was a group of people who followed a leader up a stairwell to go to the roof. And this, again, was not a bad idea, because in the 1993 bombing of the Trade Center, some people had been rescued off the roof. But in some offices, people had been educated to be told never to go to the roof in another event, that the roof would actually be locked. These people didn't have that information. It's not their fault, right? So they followed this leader up to the top. All those people who went up died. The roof was locked.
So all of them were packed together into this, or brought together in this very relatively confined space.
Not realizing what was descending on them, which was that the fires were moving from all directions, and by about 3 o'clock that afternoon, these people had basically fallen into a trap.
In the ruins of Yokohama, American entrepreneur Otis Poole is alive, but desperate to get home to his wife and children.
He looks around. Everything is rubble. The entire city has been flattened. He looks towards the Bund, a couple of blocks that way, the seafront promenade. He sees the Grand Hotel, the United Club. All of the great edifices along the waterfront have been destroyed. Flames are already shooting out from many of these buildings.
With the fires in hot pursuit, he heads for his home high on the bluffs, not knowing whether his family has survived.
He turns towards the creek, this body of water, a channel of water about 20 meters wide that flows into Yokohama Bay. 4 bridges completely collapsed, but he's got to get across it. He has no idea whether they're alive or dead. He just knows he's got to get there and find out what has happened to them.
With the flames behind him, spreading faster than a man can run, Poole is now in a race to save his family. Firestorms rage across the Kanto region of Japan, including the cities of Tokyo and Yokohama, one of the most densely populated areas of the world.
We're talking about fires that involve multiple structures at once, entire city blocks being involved by the same fire.
As Yokohama burns behind him, Otis Poole makes it to the top of the bluffs, where he finds his family unscathed by the earthquake, but they're still far from safety. With the firestorm in hot pursuit, they're now cornered on the very edge of the precipice.
We're standing here at the very top of the bluff. The bluff is essentially a cliff face, almost a 90-degree angle extending straight down to what used to be beachfront right here, and beyond it was Yokohama Bay.
The Poole family's only hope of survival is to go over the edge, a drop of more than 150 feet. Back in the Honjo district of Tokyo, more than 40,000 people, salvaging whatever they can carry, are crammed onto a 15-acre depot site. Surrounded by a raging firestorm, this is supposed to be a place of safety.
9月1日午後2時頃 is the caption that tells us that this photograph was taken on September 1st in the afternoon around 2 o'clock. A short while before the disaster at the Honjo clothing depot.
Within the next 15 minutes, all of these people will die. But even though they are now completely surrounded by flames, they show no sense of panic or alarm.
So I spent a lot of time researching, talking to survivors, looking at documents, looking at the history of disasters that have been carefully studied. And it was actually really hard to find cases of panic as defined by widespread antisocial behavior. The group doesn't like that behavior. That is not generally in your survival interest. To become hysterical or to hurt people or misbehave. When you think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, you want to be in groups, you become very social, you want to help each other. And you hear that again and again.
Somewhere within this mass of humanity is 10-year-old Shin Nakamura. At the time of the earthquake, he'd been watching a Charlie Chaplin movie. Now, along with 40,000 other people, he's directed to the depot area in Hanzhou. And like everyone else there, Shin thinks he's safe.
Because there was some sense that the fires might be encroaching, but again, there wasn't an ability to go anywhere else, and there wasn't a clear line of sight necessarily that the fires were coming that much closer.
On the bluffs of Yokohama, Otis Poole and his family are trapped, caught between the firestorm and a 150-foot high cliff. Their only hope is to climb down the 90-degree precipice using nets from a tennis court.
The nets fall down and extend to a point about 15 meters above the beachfront. Still potentially fatal fall for anybody who manages to rappel down them.
With his son riding on his shoulders, tied to a rope secured from above, Poole begins to rappel down the cliff face. He reaches a narrow ledge, edges across, and then slides down with his son to safety on the beach.
Poole makes it back across the cliff face, climbs back up, takes his second son, does the exact same thing. He gets the second son to the ledge, moves him across, slides down the gravel moraine to safety. 2 sons, 1 son to go. As Poole moves back across this narrow ledge, he looks up at the top of the cliffs and sees that his father-in-law has already started down the nets with his third and youngest son. They just get to the point where they're on the ledge, which remember is 17 or 18 meters above the seafront, when the youngest son slips He grabs his grandfather's shirt collar. He's dangling with 3 fingers secured to his grandfather's shirt collar, slipping slowly, one finger in after another, about to fall to his death. Otis sees this happening, jumps up, races back across this narrow ledge, reaches out, grabs his youngest son, sweeps him from his father-in-law, holds him tightly, securely, and then moves back across the ledge and slides down the gravel moraine to safety.
As Poole looks up from the beach, he sees flames are engulfing the top of the cliff. He has cheated death by a matter of seconds. But for 40,000 people in Hanzhou, there is no escape route away from the fires.
One of the results of this is that the people crowd even more closely together. The fuel that people had brought with them, and I'm using fuel here to talk about things like bedding and pieces of furniture and the like, began to ignite. The temperature just reached a point where anything that was flammable would burst into flames. And this eventually includes the clothing that people were wearing.
As the sky above becomes black as night, and the air around becomes superheated, something horrific happens. Out of the wall of smoke and flames, a monstrous force of nature descends on the throng of people. A dragon twister, a tornado of fire, breathing flames of death. In the wake of a devastating earthquake, the cities of Tokyo and Yokohama are set upon by these freaks of nature that rampage across the city. And the biggest of them all is at the Hanjo Depot. It's the perfect storm within a storm. A spinning fury of fire with 40,000 people now at its mercy, including one 10-year-old boy.
Shin Nakamura describes in horrific detail the sky turning black, the sea turning as black as night.
Throughout history, there have been other sightings of fire tornadoes, but the Dragon Twister at Hanjo is extraordinary, the biggest ever seen. It's a blazing monster spawned by a nightmarish combination of factors. Fires hot enough to melt metal, winds of hurricane force, and superheated updrafts of air. The result? A flaming vortex 650 feet high, almost 1,000 feet across, with a spinning velocity of 125 miles an hour. It's a terror Shin Nakamura was helpless against.
He grabbed his younger brother's hand as the twister descended on them and watched as the boy slipped out of his grasp, literally lifted into the air and disappeared. Almost like a scene out of The Wizard of Oz, the little boy flying off into oblivion. He then reached out for his younger sister, who was in a kimono with an obi, a Japanese belt, grabbed her by the obi, holding on to her and feeling her slip from his grasp, and then she too disappeared into the whirlwind. And one by one, he describes every member of his family disappearing. At some point, he fell unconscious. When he woke up, minutes or even hours later, he was at the bottom of a pile of bodies and realized that he was essentially one of the only survivors of this fire tornado.
These are images of bodies for as far as the eye can see in the clothing depot. Again, from the front of the frame of the photograph all the way through.
In the space of just 15 minutes, the fire tornado crosses the depot ground as many as 3 times.
The casualties, those killed by the fire, the estimates range from between 35,000 people up until about 38,000 people. One of the reasons those estimates are relatively unspecific is that entire families are lost. There are no records of them. It was impossible to identify many of the bodies.
The next day, the police chief of Hanjo is so devastated by the disaster and guilt-ridden for directing so many people to their deaths that out of shame and horror, he commits seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment.
It was not his fault, who had any way of knowing, but he felt that it was his obligation to kill himself.
On September 2nd, 1923, Japan's Kanto region is a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The country's 2 principal cities, Tokyo and Yokohama, have been razed to the ground. After 90 years, the horror of that moment still haunts Tei Suzuki.
昨日はゲタバク皆さんにねこの中で食料を持っている方はどうか皆さん少しずつでもいいから分けて皆さんにあげてくださいって言って申し上げました。
But the perfect storm is not yet finished. Because once nature has done its worst, the survivors of the disaster will turn upon each other.
Fute Senjin および主義者の一流はその後 The phrase Fute Senjin is one translation of it would be malcontent Korean. It refers to the Korean colonial subjects. One is that they're insurrectionists, that they're likely to try and challenge Japanese colonial power and Japanese authority. The other is this sense of untrustworthiness, that they're not reliable, that if you turn your back on them, that they will harm you.
The most defenseless minority members of the society somehow are singled out.
Fute Senjin, kakudokoro ni hoka.
Rumors got out that the Koreans, if they were not responsible for the actual calamity, had decided to take advantage of the chaos after the earthquake. Koreans were hunted down, beginning in Yokohama within the first hours of the earthquake.
So these rumors, these stories, these fictional accounts essentially are being spread as truth.
After earthquake and fire, death now comes in the form of the lynch mob. Within hours, Kanto has become a wasteland, stalked by vigilantes and mob rule. Throughout history, the survivors of natural disasters have looked for scapegoats. And in what is left of Tokyo and Yokohama, it's the minority Korean population that proves easy prey.
They hunted down and butchered in large numbers.
Every mode of causing bodily harm is done to these people, including women, children, adults. The killing spares no one.
It was just an orgy of killing that went on for several days.
Historians and others have looked very closely at this, estimate that on the order of 6,000 people were killed, deliberately killed.
The final death toll of the Great Kanto earthquake stands at more than 120,000 people. The exact figure is not known because entire families and whole neighborhoods simply disappeared and were lost to history.
死んだらそれでおしまいっていうもんじゃないと思いまして、自分のお寺に毎年9月1日には、お金を毎朝でも送って、それでお経をあげてもらって、亡くなった方たちのお経をあげてもらって今日になりました。
On the site of the old depot grounds, there now stands a memorial hall. Inside are urns containing the ashes of more than 40,000 people who burned to death on this spot in just 15 minutes.
Some would say that it left Japan in a moral crisis and it left it open for the tragedies that would come next in the 1930s and the 1940s.
In the wake of the devastation, Westerners like Otis Poole will leave Japan for good. And the nation that had recently welcomed outsiders will again seal itself off from the world. In the coming years, Japan will look to the army for leadership and embrace a newfound militarism that will result in the tragedy of World War II. Alongside the victims of 1923, this hall also contains the ashes of more than 100,000 people who died 22 years later in the U.S. firebombing of Tokyo. The victims not of a natural disaster, but of precise military planning.
The areas that are destroyed in the aftermath as a result of the March 1945 fire bombings by the Americans are almost identical to the areas that were most hard hit by the Great Kanto earthquake. They all burn out. So the idea that this could happen again, that Japanese neighborhoods were flammable, that the city could be destroyed in much the same way as the earthquake had done it, is something that American planners are very much aware of.
'21st century Tokyo is a city reborn out of the ashes of catastrophe, a megalopolis of the future which is still haunted by the traumas of its past. After earthquake, fire tornadoes, and anarchy, nothing in this place would ever be the same again. Tokyo and Yokohama, September 1923, The Perfect Storm.